Let's now turn to Gönenç. You're a lawyer,
Yes.
Slightly different perspective.
Right.
We have a lot of trained economists around, including, I must say, me, for which apologies. What's your perspective on this? What's good about this? What's missing?
Thank you. First of all, knowing Ms. Ayşe Sinirlioğlu, the Sherpa to G20, I'm pretty sure this communique is going to be penetrated into the G20, and it is well worth, really. Quite a lot of effort has gone into this. And also, while she is here and we get to talk publicly about it, we should say that it would be a good idea to reserve a permanent seat to C20 in the G20 Development Working Group. I think the C20 of this year has earned it and deserved it. The C20 is always, every year this is happening, the C20 gets discussed and questioned, and how should we model it and all that. I think this might be the year that this ends. Now, coming back to the communique, I'm unable to talk about everything in 5 minutes, but I'd like to talk about the participatory and democratic decision-making processes should be supported bit of it. That sounds more like a wish rather than a recipe, obviously. And to make it sound more like a recipe, a lot of work has been done already in the communique. The bit that I would like to underline will be the importance of freedom of speech in all of this, as it seems to me that whenever a society is kind of puzzled in how to make that society embrace democracy in a truer sense of the word, freedom of speech comes into gameplay, and civil societies are hotbeds of freedom of speech, or if they're not truly civil societies. So perhaps a take on what democracy isn't. Democracy in and of itself is not a virtue, in my view. So, as Winston Churchill has once said, the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. From a Schumpeterian perspective of democracy, i.e., only the ability to go to the ballot box and render your vote, really you're not stimulating all that is growth stimulating. And you're not stimulating the innovation as much as you could. It's better than a dictatorship, you could argue, but some people might make a case of the Soviet Union back in the day or the China of today. But still, the upshot would be that you need a healthy degree of deeper, full-fledged democracy, which would only be attained through proper freedom of speech. And the reason why that is so obvious to say is because when a right is not exercised or protected, it really does not exist. So regardless of what you have in your legislation as a right given to the people, actually to the extent it cannot be claimed or protected, that right does not start functioning. And to the extent individual rights and civil rights are a fundamental element, bedrock of true democracies, the only way of having them beyond having them in a legislation, i.e. having them in a claimable fashion, would be to have room for freedom of speech. And the same freedom of expression would actually function in tackling the issue of lack of innovation. So from an economist's perspective, the dynamic efficiencies that need to be stimulated in the society would also be handled most properly through maximization of freedom of speech. That is quite a direct balance, actually, because what would happen is, by way of freeing the market for ideas, you would be maximizing ideas themselves, the way a free market economy works about everything. So the freer you get your market for ideas, there would be more ideas, they would clash against each other, the resilience of the ideas would increase, and more importantly, perhaps, negative externalities of ideas or poorer quality of ideas would get to be understood as what they are in a society, which would tackle also the problem of populist approaches in politics that sometimes could be prompted through the mere existence of a democracy that does not have a day-to-day impact on the societies living. Let me stop there. I don't know if I have reached my 5 minutes, but let me give a pause there.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. On the easier point of how to deal with the C20, G20 interaction, I think the C20 people will have to follow up that the ball does not get dropped while it's on its way to China. And it being dropped may take many forms. It doesn't necessarily have to be that China willfully scraps all the work that is done, which does not seem to be likely, but it could be that a lot of redundant work may be done. And that's always a problem with these kinds of projects, or rather organizations, when every year you do a work in a different country. I once had the idea of having it for 2 years, but then Ayşe Sinirlioğlu said it's a very burdensome process, so it has to be 1 year and it has to circulate more frequently, so I backed off of that broadcast. But when it is every year going to a different country, you can count on it that probably the new chairs and the new people will be so anxious to hit deadlines and create something meaningful that they may not be able to look at what has been done in the past. And that is a dear cost to pay. I am only qualified to also comment on the mega projects matter. Unfortunately, I can't speak about the shelters situation or some of the other questions that have been raised. But on the question of mega projects, obviously, and following up on what Ufuk has said too, we have to observe that regardless of the identity of the government or which country we're talking about, the longer governments stay in power, the more tendencies they will develop to monopolize economic opportunities of a society. That is just going to happen. And the only way of keeping that in check and in balance is by way of rule of law. If you don't have that, then mega projects could well be a wonderful pretext of accelerating that process. And the rule of law would have to take the appearance of an independent judiciary. It would have to take the appearance of a strong, as Daron would call it, rambunctious media. And it would also mean that you need transparency in voting on what to do and what not to do. Take an example of Turkey. As Turkish citizens, we've always wanted to host Olympics. But it's a whole different question as to whether it would be good for the country's welfare distribution and the equitable welfare distribution if Turkey had gotten the Olympics in a given environment. So it all comes down to not doing the mega projects, but rather doing the mega projects with the correct checks and balances systems, which can only be attained through rule of law.